First-class river vessel, Coast Guard certified. Once again, I'll just reiterate what the captain said. Please don't stand on any of the benches or lean out over the railings. If you drop something into the Chicago River, it belongs to the river now. We cannot get it back for you. I like to think of this boat, however, as my dodgy time machine. Now, why is it a time machine, you might be wondering? And why is it particularly dodgy? Well, that's because my job this evening is to tell you about the amazing architecture, both natural and man-made, in the city of Chicago. And I was going to do that in the most straightforward way possible. I would start 10,000 years ago with the creation of the Great Lakes and the Chicago River, and I would work chronologically all the way up through the present day and some of the more recent buildings on the Chicago skyline. But Chicago is a wonderful, living, breathing organism of a city which refuses to arrange itself chronologically for my benefit. So instead, I am going to bounce us around all over the place in time like we're in a Doctor Who episode, or perhaps Quantum Leap, if that is more your time travel speed. I am going to start us at the beginning, however. 10,000 years ago was the end of the last ice age, and as the massive ice sheets that covered most of North America at the time melted and retreated, they gouged out giant depressions in the Earth's surface and filled them up, creating the Great Lakes as we know them today. The modern-day Great Lakes, including Lake Michigan, contain 1/5 of the entire world's fresh water supply. As we head out of our dock, if you look off to the left-hand side of the boat, you'll see the lock that controls entrance from Lake Michigan onto the Chicago River, which is what we are on right now. Excuse me. The lake is generally about 4 or 5 feet higher than the Chicago River. That can change if there's a big storm surge coming in off the lake level can rise, or if there's a big rainstorm that comes in from the west, the river level can rise as well, at which point that lock is opened to try and equalize. Luckily, it smells much better out tonight. In fact, sometimes in Chicago, you'll notice a mysterious chocolate smell that wafts down the street. That is because of a chocolate factory up Kinsey Street. They roast their beans every couple of days, and when they do that, the smell can waft all the way through downtown and out into the suburbs. Now, I mentioned the Chicago River sits about 3 or 4 feet lower than the lake on average, but that's not the way it used to be. It used to be that the Chicago River flowed out into Lake Michigan to the east. That's the natural flow of the river that we are on right now. But that became a problem for Chicago as the city continued to grow. It's because as Chicago grew, we were dumping all of our sewage and garbage and byproducts from the meatpacking industry into the Chicago River, which was flowing out into Lake Michigan, which is also where the city gets all of its drinking water from, and it was making a lot of people very, very sick. So in the year 1900, we called in the Army Corps of Engineers, who still run the lock out to Lake Michigan today, and they dug a bunch of canals down the south branch of the Chicago River, connecting it to the Des Plaines River at a lower elevation. Those two waterways didn't used to connect, but they do now. And in doing so, we gave the water a different direction to flow downhill. So using just the force of gravity, we reversed the flow of the Chicago River, sending all of our water and garbage into the Des Plaines River, which flows into the Mississippi down towards the city of St. Louis. The city of St. Louis was not happy about this arrangement. We did not ask them first. They did not want our garbage. They actually sued the city of Chicago. The court ruled in Chicago's favor because it was determined to be a matter of life and death for us. And they said the water was diluted enough by the time it got to St. Louis that it wasn't as much of a problem for them. Nowadays, the river is much, much cleaner, so it's not really much of a problem for anyone. But that does mean that theoretically, we could take this boat into the south branch of the Chicago River, all the way to the Mississippi, down towards New Orleans, out into the Gulf of Mexico, around Florida, up the eastern seaboard, and back into the Great Lakes through the St. Lawrence Seaway, back here to the city of Chicago. But that would take slightly longer than the 1 hour you have allotted for your boat tour this evening, and it is a little bit chilly tonight, so we will not be doing that. Instead, I'm going to jump us forward in time and start talking about the man-made architecture here in the city of Chicago. We're going to start with 1924 and this white building behind me with the clock tower on top of it. That is the Wrigley Building. And if you're looking at that thinking, wow, that looks pretty ornate for 1924, it looks older, that is on purpose. This is a style called Spanish Revivalism. was a popular style in the United States in the 1920s. As American architects were finding their own in-house styles, we would often call back to older, more Eurocentric styles from centuries past. The clock tower on top of the Wrigley building is actually modeled off of La Giralda clock tower at the cathedral in Seville, Spain. And that bright white terracotta tiling that's so beautifully lit up in the night is so fragile that to this day it has to be washed by hand using only soap and water. The Wrigley building bears the name of the Wrigley Chewing Gum Company. That is a big Chicago name. It's also on Wrigley Field, the baseball stadium just north of Clark Street. It's going to be a bit of a motif on this tour. Big Chicago names. Names that are dotted around the Chicago River sometimes appear other places in town, and I will call those out as we pass them. Speaking of big names, I bet you'll never guess the name of the building directly behind me. This is, of course, Trump International Hotel and Tower, designed in 2009 by a man named Adrian Smith, so I've jumped us forward in time again. Trump Tower is a great example of a more modern style called contextualism. If you look up the sides of the tower, you'll see 3 flat patios ascending the building. Those are called setbacks, and each one of those corresponds with the height of one of the buildings around the tower. The first setback is the same height as the roof of the Wrigley building, which we just talked about. The second one corresponds to the height of Mather Tower, this skinny rocket ship looking building off the left-hand side of the boat. And the third one is the same height as AMA Plaza, the black boxy building peeking out from around the side of Trump Tower. If you look directly off to the right-hand side of the boat, you'll see a wavy pattern in the first couple of floors of Trump Tower. That is another contextualist feature that mimics the waves in the Chicago River. So the building is built in context, both with the natural elements around it and the buildings that came here before it. Coming up next on the right-hand side of the boat are some of the more iconic buildings on this architecture tour. I like to call them the corn cobs. Their actual name is Marina City, but they kind of look like a pair of corn cobs. That's a funny nickname. Funny nicknames are going to be another motif on this architecture tour. If we like your building in Chicago, we might give it a funny nickname. Some architects and artists really enjoy this. Some really don't. I know Anish Kapoor, the designer of the Cloud Gate sculpture at Millennium Park, really hates when we here in Chicago call it the Bean. But it looks like a bean, so we're going to keep calling it that because we think it's cute. Coming back to Marina City, these towers weren't actually designed to look like corn cobs. They were designed with a sunflower in mind. The apartments around the outside all start very narrow at the door and flare out into this sort of petal shape down the sides of the building. Now underneath the apartments, that petal shape continues, but it becomes valet-only parking. Valet only because if you're not very, very careful, you might drive your car into the river. Underneath that valet-only parking, you have a steakhouse, there's a movie theater in there, the Chicago House of Blues, and underneath, a place to park your boat. Truly a city within a city, everything you could possibly need in one location. Marina City was built in the year 1968 by a man named Bertrand Goldberg. They were a bit of a social experiment to see if Bertrand Goldberg could get people to come and live down here along the Chicago River. There weren't a lot of people living along the river at the time because the river was still very, very dirty. It had been for decades. But that started to change. In the year 1972, Congress passed the Clean Water Act, and from that time on, the river has been getting cleaner and nicer. At the time of the passage of the Clean Water Act, there were only 7 species of fish found living in the Chicago River. Today, there are over 70. I saw a heron on one of my tours just a couple of weeks ago, flew right in front of the boat. And earlier this year, Chicagoans found a massive snapping turtle living up the north branch of the Chicago River. We named him Chonkosaurus. It's another funny nickname. Now, as the river has gotten cleaner and nicer, people have wanted to spend more and more time down here. If you look directly off to the left-hand side of the boat, you'll see a section of the Chicago River Walk. Now, the Chicago River Walk was designed in the year 1909, but we only started building it around the turn of the millennium, and it was completed in 2016. It's a great example of Chicago continuing to work on itself and improve itself through time. Another great example of Chicago moving through time is this building coming up on the left-hand side of the boat with a black dividing line running down the length of it. That's the builder's building, and it was built in 2 different decades. The first part of the building that we're passing is from the 1920s, and it's our first example of Art Deco architecture on the tour. It has deep inset windows, long vertical lines that draw the eye upward, and some machine-cut patterning along the outside, including those neoclassical columns at the top. Now, after that black dividing line, we have a section of the building from the 1980s. That is a postmodern section, but you can see it respects the line established by the Art Deco section that came before it. Now, having just introduced you to Art Deco architecture, you'll see a much more massive example of it coming up on the right-hand side of the boat. This is the merchandise mart, and you can see those same Art Deco elements. Deep inset windows, long vertical lines that draw the eye upward, and that machine patterning along the outside in those gold squares and chevron shapes. You'll also see coming up on the right-hand side of the boat some massive heads on pillars facing the merchandise mart. Those are the merchant princes of Chicago. Men like Marshall Field of Field & Co. That's another big Chicago name. His name is on the Field Museum of Natural History. The merchandise mart was so large, when it was first constructed, it was built with its own train station, its own fire station. For years, there was so much mail coming in and out of this building that it had its very own zip code. It was built for warehouse stock, the kind of place you would go not to buy one sofa, but to buy 5,000 sofas. We're heading into an area of the river known as Wolf Point. Wolf Point is where the main branch of the Chicago River, which we've been on so far, meets the north branch, which runs up to the right, and the south branch, which runs down to the left, and which we'll turn down in just a moment. Wolf Point is a focal point of modern contextualist architecture. We are surrounded by shiny glass towers, each one reflecting the other buildings around it, so it makes it look like we're at the bottom of a glass canyon. The tower right behind me with the arch cut out of the bottom and another one cut out of the top, kind of makes it look like a giant hot pocket, is River Point Tower, and it stands where the old Wolf Point Tavern used to be. That was the original heart of the city of Chicago as the city started to grow. That arch at the bottom of the tower is contextualist. It mimics the curve in the Chicago River at Wolf Point, but it's also structural. It divides the weight of this building around the train lines which run underneath it. That's what those circles are underneath the building, vents from the Amtrak lines underneath. This next shiny glass tower coming up behind me that we'll pass on the right-hand side of the boat is 150 North Riverside. You can see it's a little precariously balanced. It cuts in at the back to avoid the train lines which run behind it, and cuts in at the front to leave a 30-foot gap in between the riverfront and the building's front door. That's part of a Chicago zoning law that requires all the more modern buildings along the river to leave 30 feet from the river to their entrance so that people can enjoy being out here along the Chicago River. It does make this building kind of precariously balanced, though, and it is very windy here in the windy city of Chicago. So all of these skyscrapers have to be built to withstand something called wind drift, the force of the wind on a tall skyscraper. 150 North Riverside has a fascinating way of doing that. Up towards the top, on the inside of the building, they have something called inertial slosh dampers, which are giant tanks of water. So when the wind blows one way on the building, the water sloshes in the other direction and dampens the effect of that wind drift. I think that is a fascinating engineering solution, and also I really just enjoy saying inertial slosh dampers. Definitely sounds like something out of a Doctor Who episode. Coming up on the left-hand side of the boat, this is Bank of America Tower. And you can see the top floors of this building are all balanced on these 3-part struts that anchor it to the riverfront. That leaves room underneath for that 30-foot cutout where you have shops, cafes, places to hang out along the Chicago River. Bank of America Tower is also notable for being entirely made up of office space. There is no residential space in this building. And it was completed in November of 2020. Which is a perfect time to build a brand spanking new office building in downtown Chicago, just as the pandemic shuts everything down. Oh, hello, friends. Always making friends along the Chicago River. It would be kind of like building an Art Deco office building in downtown Chicago in 1929, just before the stock market crash. Speaking of which, that's unfortunately exactly what happened to this building off the right-hand side of the boat. This is number 2 North Riverside, and you can see those same Art Deco elements from before. Deep inset windows, long vertical lines that draw the eye upward. The machine patterning along the outside includes these obelisks right here at the riverfront. There's a bit of an Egyptian theme to this building because 1929 was also the year that King Tutankhamun's tomb was discovered in Egypt, and their Egyptology was all the rage in the US at the time. Now, after 1929 and the stock market crash, the US goes directly into the Great Depression and then straight into World War II. And for about 25 years, no one was building big new buildings in downtown Chicago. When we got back to it after the war in the 50s and 60s, styles and attitudes had changed. People didn't have time for all of that fancy Art Deco gilding anymore. They wanted something simple, something practical. They wanted to get back to work. And we get to the advent of black box modernism, typified by gateway number 1 and gateway number 2, these big black cubes off to the right-hand side of the boat. Black box modernism was a style pioneered by a man named Mies van der Rohe, and you may be familiar with his famous expression, "less is more." He firmly believed that form follows function. So, what is the function of an office building? Well, it has to have space inside for a whole bunch of cubicles. So by moving the steel supports to the outside of the building and leaving them exposed, you free up space inside for those cubicles to be stacked ever closer together, turning a whole bunch of little cubes into one giant cube. It's a great time. If you look right off to the right-hand side of the boat, you can see all the trains. 3 branches of the Chicago River come together. The south branch comes down the side of the building to where we are now, represented by that giant red marker. Looks like a big Lego block. It's office space for companies like Uber, Walgreens, and Pepsi. But when it was constructed, this was the largest post office in the entire world. And that is because of all the mail coming in and out of this building from the mail order companies based out of Chicago. Companies like Marshall Field & Co. or Sears and Roebuck. Sears, another big, have landed us in the year 1871. Oh boy, it is time to talk about the Chicago Fire. Not the show on NBC, nor indeed the Major League Soccer team that we named the Chicago Fire. I mean the actual Great Chicago Fire of October 8th, 1871. Just a few blocks west of where we are now at that time, there stood a house owned by Patrick and 4-5. On the right-hand side of the tower, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And that is because they had to lop off an entire section of this building, because you have to stick to the plan. Now, after doing that, the facade of the Murdoch Center was adjusted so that it still looks symmetrical, but it's an optical illusion. You might never notice that an entire section of this building was missing, unless, of course, some schmuck on a boat with a microphone told you about it. It's too good a story. Coming up on the right-hand side of the boat, you'll see a squat-looking building with a big number 55 at the top of it. That is 55 West Wacker. It's a style that we haven't talked about yet on the tour called Brutalism. Brutalism was another popular post-World War II architectural style from around flying buttresses. Those are those arches which cascade off the top of the tower and down the outside. Now, in an actual old French Gothic cathedral, those flying buttresses would literally buttress the weight of the tower, helping it stay upright. Now, Tribune Tower has modern steel supports on the inside of it, so those flying buttresses are mainly artistic in nature. But they do make the entire tower kind of look like Rouen Cathedral in France, which it is designed after. The Chicago Tribune Tower was originally the home of the Chicago Tribune newspaper. Now no longer is. They sold the building a couple of years back, and now it's high-end apartment buildings. It does still have the Chicago Tribune name on the side of it, though, and just underneath that name you can see the Apple Store. The Apple Store has another funny postmodern joke in its design. The roof of it kind of makes the entire thing look like a giant laptop. It is also historically significant as the location of the first permanent residence of a non-native person in Chicago. This is where Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable built his trading post across from Fort Dearborn. Coming up on the left-hand side of the boat, you'll see a tall tower with the NBC logo on top of it. You might be thinking, I know this one. We've talked about this style a lot on the tour. I see deep inset windows. I see long vertical lines that draw my eye upward. This is an Art Deco building. But you would be wrong, because this building is playing a trick on you. It is from 1989, designed by Adrian Smith, the same man who designed Trump Tower. And it is a style called Eco Deco, a postmodern style that makes certain callbacks to the Art Deco style that came before it. It is also a sister building to 30 Rockefeller in New York, so it may look familiar for that reason. Rising towards us off the right-hand side of the boat are three wavy-looking dark glass towers. You can see some vapor coming off the top of it up there. That is the St. Regis. It's one of the more recent additions to the Chicago skyline. It was completed just earlier this year, designed by a Chicago architect named Jeannie Gang. We love Jeannie Gang in Chicago. She's a recipient of the MacArthur Genius Grant and is currently hard at work on the redesign of O'Hare Airport. The St. Regis is the third tallest building in Chicago behind Trump Tower and the Sears Tower. However, if you were to stand on top of the St. Regis, you could look down onto the roof of Trump Tower. And that is because Trump Tower has a spire on top of it. It's not a competition. The St. Regis is, though, the tallest building in the world, designed by a woman-led architecture firm. It is so tall that it uses 3 different methods of combating wind drift. We've talked about 2 of them already. The first are inertial slosh dampers, giant tanks of water up towards the top of that building that slosh back and forth in the wind. The second is a bundled tower approach, like the Sears Tower. These 3 towers pressed together take some of the force of the wind off the top of the building and keep it from tipping over in the east-west direction. That's the prevailing wind in Chicago. As they were building it, though, they found they were still getting too much motion up towards the top of the St. Regis. So they put in, or rather took out, the most direct method of combating wind drift. Those are called blow-through floors. Up towards the top of that tower, there's 2 whole floors with no windows and nothing in them. That is so the wind can blow directly through the middle of the building. And while that is the most direct method of combating wind drift, it is also the most expensive. That is 2 whole floors of real estate that they can now no longer sell. And the penthouses up towards the top of the St. Regis have been selling for up to $20.5 million. The wavy pattern of the St. Regis is a contextualist feature. It mimics the waves in the Chicago River. It is an optical illusion, though. This building is entirely made up of straight lines. That wavy pattern is made by indents and overhangs of as little as 4 inches going up and down the height of the building. I think it's absolutely gorgeous. It changes color in the light. I talk about this building so much on the tour now that my phone, which is always listening, has started offering me advertisements for apartments in the St. Regis. Like I have $20.5 million, which is a nice thought, but no. Coming up on the left-hand side of the boat, you'll see another wavy-looking glass tower with a big round room lit up blue on top of it. Some kids say that makes it look like a fidget spinner. Some adults say it looks like a flask. I say it looks lonely. It is the only high-rise building on the east side of Lakeshore Drive. This is Lake Point Tower. And the reason it's lonely out there is there's another Chicago zoning law that says you're not supposed to build high-rise buildings on the east side of Lakeshore Drive. That leaves the lakefront open so we can enjoy all the lovely public space along Lake Michigan, the beaches and bike paths and so forth. But there was a loophole right at the mouth of the Chicago River. Now, I don't know exactly what the city was planning on building at the mouth of the river, but it wasn't Lake Point Tower. So they closed that loophole, and this will remain the only high-rise building on the east side of DuSable Lakeshore Drive, which we are passing underneath now. And as we head back out towards Lake Michigan, off to the left-hand side of the boat, you can see Navy Pier. Navy Pier has a fascinating history. It was a barracks during World War I. During World War II, it was a training ground for Navy pilots. Former President George H.W. Bush actually got his pilot's wings training at Navy Pier. Nowadays, Navy Pier is home to the Chicago Shakespeare Theater, the Chicago Children's Museum, a whole bunch of great restaurants and traveling exhibitions, and our modern-day Ferris wheel. We love a Ferris wheel here in Chicago. The original Ferris wheel at the 1893 Chicago World's Fair was even taller than this one. It was 264 feet tall and had cars that could accommodate up to 60 passengers. 61 if you include the bartender that staffed every car. As we turn out towards the lock, we're not going to go through the lock. We're going to stay on the Chicago River and we're going to turn the boat around and head back towards our home dock. I'm going to jump off the microphone for a moment, get myself a drink of water, because I've been talking for a good long time. And I'll let you enjoy this fantastic view of the Chicago skyline. It is one of the best views of the city you can get here at the mouth of the Chicago River. I'll take a little walk around the boat. If you have any questions, I can attempt to answer them now. I will hop back on the microphone as we make our turn back towards our home dock to wrap things up. See you all in just a moment.